Hey, what's up? Get Brocked here. People seem to enjoy these semi-theory conceptual videos, so here goes. A spicy one. Mac-style weapons suck. They suck in execution, they suck in theory, and they are just rule of cool to an extreme. Alright, now that everyone is marginally upset, let's get into a little prelude before we get started. I'm a material science engineer, so I do have a fairly decent background understanding of materials, physics, and more, but I've been wrong many times, so I'll try to sum up why I came to the conclusions I did. At the end of the day, this is a fun thought experiment. The reality is we're discussing something that's going to happen 200 plus years in the future, so there's a very good chance none of this even applies. I'm more so talking about Mac in science fiction and how it's portrayed and how realistically things might actually happen instead, even by that universe's own standard. Let's get into some qualifiers before we start. What do I mean by Mac? Well, if you're the two people on my channel that don't follow Halo or have played Halo, whatever, a Mac is something like an electromagnetic accelerator, coil, Gauss, railgun, all are fundamentally the same thing. They use the same principle to accelerate a projectile down either a parallel or a barreled type magnetic accelerator, right? So functionally they're all the same. The arrangement of the coils or magnets change depending on coil, Gauss, whatever. A big component of what makes a Mac a magnetic accelerator cannon is that it is a axial weapon in the context of space engineers, in the context of space battles, whatever. So they take up a large percentage of the ship that's using it, typically the entire length of the ship, because the quality or the effectiveness of the weapon is directly proportional to the length of the barrel, right? You can only squeeze so many magnets in the length of a barrel, and unlike gunpowder, where you can run out of gunpowder, and an infinitely long barrel is not a good idea because A, the pressure will decrease as the bullet moves along the barrel, or B, you need so much gunpowder to have a constant increasing pressure that you will end up blowing yourself up. But that's not an issue with an axial magnetic accelerator. You can actually increase it infinitely long and it won't be an issue short of trying to keep it aligned. So yeah, it's an axial weapon that spans a large percentage of the ship and takes up a large percentage of the ship's length, otherwise you're not doing it right. These weapons are incredibly power hungry. Due to the nature of electromagnets and the speed that these have to, go at, you can never really power these from a reactor. You have to use something like a capacitor bank or whatever technology in the future mimics a capacitor bank. Right? Because unless new technology comes along, batteries or reactors cannot discharge greater than their capacity or greater than their ability. Therefore, you need something like a capacitor to discharge in a rapid fashion. Capacitors generally suck for long-term power storage and are also dangerous for ships in combat, so you will almost always have a reload cycle as you recharge your capacitor banks or whatever equivalent thing you're using in the future. Another point. The projectiles are almost universally unguided. The g-forces required to accelerate an unguided projectile in a system like this to generally a percentage of the speed of light is too much for a guidance system to handle, or even basic tracking computers or RCS or something. So it also takes away from the projectile's mass and payload. Finally, in this discussion, I'm not talking about small-scale accelerators. I'm talking about capital-grade weapons. So having an accelerator as a point defense gun or a close-in weapon system or a secondary weapon system, that's fine, right? That bypassing the need for chemical propellant in that scenario makes sense. I'm talking about a capital-grade ship's length weapon, not making any sense. All right, with that out of the way, I'm going to split this video up into two parts. This is a Space Engineers channel, so part 2 I'll talk about the railguns in Space Engineers, which are functionally the same thing, right, technology-wise. But I will start with the more sci-fi end of the stick with this video. Let's get into real quick why they're good. Number one, while they're relatively expensive in employment, right, it's an incredibly expensive weapon. Electromagnets, capacitors, and the projectiles it's shooting are all ridiculously expensive because these are more complex molecules or atoms, for the lack of a better term, right? Batteries and electromagnets are quite rare, relatively speaking, in the universe, so they're expensive to make. But once you have them, they're actually relatively cheap in shooting. What do I mean? Well, a brick of tungsten is fairly cheap compared to, 2 or 3 missiles that would be the analog, right? Missiles are expensive. You have propellant. You have complex electronic equipment on board. You have a lot of space issues, so on and so forth, right? You have no propellant required for your railgun. Another good aspect: war is a game of munitions, and who has the most munitions when talking about isolated ship systems, like in the Navy, or in this case, in Space Navy. So the Mac always typically has ammo. It's tough to use up all your ammo for a Mac versus a missile system, which you can actually just burn through your entire missile system by accident when you get too aggressive, right? This is a big issue that Navy ships can run into, right? That's a big aspect of it. You could quickly also get to the point where you have the tech to have a rapid-fire Mac style system, right? In Halo, for example, the reload times are typically quite long. Even the most OP doesn't really make sense ship, like the Infinity, has a fairly long reload cycle, though it can, I believe it can double tap for each of the guns. But once that is done, it takes a while to charge the capacitors back up, versus theoretically, there's not too much stopping you from having technology that allows you to basically autocannon a Mac system. Heat also is overstated as an issue. There are ways right now we can mitigate heat, and in the future, that is even more so a thing. So I don't think that's nearly as big of an issue as people make it out to be. The damage profile of a Mac weapon is quite strong, and it's innately armor penetrating against hardened armor, right? We're not talking about like reactive armor, but against hardened targets, the profile is very favorable. It's very inherently armor penetrative. Kind of like APFSDS. God, I fucking hate that acronym. But the way it does damage works out quite well versus chemical projectiles, which struggle to get the velocity, thus must also rely on shape charges and all the likes, which can be quite easily defeated with, reactive systems. I'm going to be making some assumptions because we have to make assumptions, because in these sci-fi universes, there's typically, it's not fully fleshed out, like hard details. First off, I'm going to make the assumptions that space battles will likely occur like they do in Stellaris, Halo, and other sci-fi scenarios. Right, we have fleet combat, a decent number of ships typically, but you can have smaller number of ships. But I'm going to assume space battles are going to be more like Stellaris, Halo, versus something like Star Wars, where ships are basically in like rock throwing distance of each other, right? So we're going to assume it's more standoff than some sci-fi universes state. We also have to make the assumption that point jumping isn't a thing. In Halo, the human ships don't have the resolution to point jump. It's too risky. While the Covenant do, they never really use it all that often. And then other universes, this tech just doesn't exist. Why? Well, because if you actually had high-quality point jumping abilities, long-range weapons would almost certainly not exist, because you would just point jump on top of the enemy and brawl it out, and it becomes a question of rate of fire and DPS versus effective weaponry. Finally, I'm going to assume ships in this scenario have an abundance of thrust. Right now, if we put a ship into space, the ability to constantly adjust course correct is almost non-existent. Thrust is insanely valuable. But I'm assuming in the future we're going to have a thrust drive system that allows us to have functionally near infinite fuel in a fight timescale, right? Not infinite fuel, but infinite fuel for the duration of a fight, essentially. You can do all the maneuvers you want. I'll also be mostly focusing on Halo's Mac, but a lot of universes kind of copy the premise of Halo Mac, like Stellaris, for example. Okay, what are the issues? Let's get into it, finally. Issue number 1. Projectiles are slow. What? Yeah, the projectiles are slow as shit. For what we're considering, even with something as stupidly fast as the Halo Mac, which is physics-breakingly fast, something like a near point-blank engagement for space would be like here to the moon. It would take something regular Mach 3.5 hours to impact the moon. That is too slow for an unguided projectile. Way too slow. And considering all ships will be course correcting constantly in combat situations, like we do now in the Navy, right? Erratic movements, you're not going to hit anything at 3.5 hours travel time. Even the supermach on the orbital defense stations, which that's what I'm referring to with physics breaking, takes about 30 seconds to impact the moon. We're assuming 12,000 kilometers per second versus 30 kilometers per second for the Mach. These numbers are on the wiki, though I've looked into it in the past, and the numbers don't generally agree between different source materials. And even the video games have Machs being fired in atmosphere and not wiping everyone out. So who knows where the tech level lies, but I'll be using that 12,000 and that 30 kilometers per second number. For fun, we can extend the range out even further. So from here to the sun, which is an engagement range that you'll typically see in Stellaris, the travel time will be somewhere in the neighborhood of between forever and it doesn't matter. Issue number 2. The projectiles are, well, projectiles. They're unguided. This doesn't need too much explanation, but when you combine it with the fact that the speed is actually not relatively that much at standard engagement ranges, it sort of disqualifies the Mach as something that's remotely useful when engaging at the ranges discussed above. The only reasons unguided projectiles worked in World War II is because, well, ships were traveling in a very predictable path, not doing much course corrections. They suck at evasion. They can only travel in a linear path, right? You can only go slightly left, slightly right, or straight, right? Ships in space have a 3-dimensional plane to maneuver in, and braking is much less harsh on the ship because you don't need to spin your propeller in the opposite direction from full astern, full forward, whatever. But even at the end of the day, when you look at accuracy in the Pacific Theater, for example, it ends up being something like 5% or less. That's pretty pitiful. And then you add in the fact that, this sort of kind of works, but also not really works when you have a 9 to 12 gun main battery. But then you throw in an axial weapon that typically has reload times measured in minutes. 5% accuracy is going to be pretty depressing really fast. This leads to point number 3. Enemy ships are going to be moving, and they're going to be moving a lot. Unlike what is often portrayed in Halo novels, ships can move a lot more than is portrayed. All you really need to do is displace from your current position within the travel time of the projectiles coming towards you. So, for example, if you are a frigate, all you need to do is move out of your current position and then maybe add an element of randomness at some point, and you functionally become unable to hit. Thus, the enemy actually has to come closer to you. I can't put down any defined numbers because it entirely depends on the Mach velocity and the distance that ship is to you, right? So it's much easier to dodge when you have a 10-second travel time versus a 3-second travel time. But the reality is, these ships must be within, give or take, about 300 kilometers of each other to get a realistic hit probability, even with to counteract randomized travel paths. So even at 300 kilometers, we're talking about 5-second travel time to hit a 3-dimensionally moving target. That doesn't seem bad, but let's put it another way. A 50 caliber bullet being shot to 2 miles has less travel time than a Mach at 300 kilometers. So imagine you're behind your 50 cal, you're engaging at 2 miles, and your target is running in a full randomized sprint. Can you hit that target? No, you can't. That is unrealistic. So realistically speaking, that 300 kilometers, we probably need to halve it down to 150 or even 100 kilometers. And that is really, really, really close in space to the point where basically any other weapon system will kill you before you get to 100 kilometers. Let's put it this way. We have Navy ships engaging each other at greater than 100 kilometers, right? So you're seeing what I'm starting to say here with the Mach gun doesn't seem to have a niche in ship-to-ship combat where it really makes any sense. And that brings us to the final thing. Basically every other weapon in the room is better than the Mach. Let's say our ships start at 1,500 kilometers apart and they begin the close distance. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to deploy strike craft, and those are going to intercept and become into their weapon range well before your Mac becomes into its effective weapon range. And remember, our effective weapon range is somewhere between 100 to 300 kilometers, and even then, it's kind of depressing. So strike craft are going to get into weapon range first. And then you have to consider the fact that missiles are going to be far more effective. You can kind of just chuck a missile into space, give it an initial booster stage, it approaches to 50 kilometers, and then it lights its main engine and hones in on target. Is it going as fast? No, but it doesn't need to be. You're going to end up with significantly higher hit probability, nearly 100%. Now you're going to be like, well, point defense or other intercepted missiles will take care of that missiles. Yes, absolutely. But you're going to be using missiles in high quantities, like 50 missiles, 100 missiles. We don't know the scale and space and how big our ships are going to be, but you're going to be using a lot of missiles in conjunction to increase your hit chance to get through a defensive thing, whatever is going to be used at the time. And then when you consider the fact that the concept of nuclear weapons being taboo in space is probably incorrect and a remnant of nukes being taboo on Earth, well, the payloads are going to be actually roughly similar, though the damage profile will be different. But regardless, the reality is the hit probability of a missile, a basic missile system, is going to be significantly higher than a Max system because there is no burden of range. Now, a lot of people are going to say something along the lines of, well, have both. But the reality is space and naval combat, right? Space combat does kind of mimic naval combat, is a game of numbers. Your Max system will probably cost you a good percentage of the cost of your ship. And if we're talking 100 kilometers is our optimal fire range, and 300 kilometers is probably going to give us something like a 5% hit ratio, well, it might make sense to just build another ship, or have room for more missiles, or whatever, make your ship lighter. It doesn't make sense to have a weapon that requires a huge percentage of your ship that is so ineffectual at ranges that are, practically speaking, considered point blank for space. Now, people are going to say, make the damn thing go faster. All right, let's make it go faster. Let's make our Mac go really fast. So if we shot a Mac round at 20% the speed of light, how would we do? Well, we're still at 5 seconds to travel the distance to the moon, which is what I would consider a realistic space engagement range. All right, let's make it go faster. 50%. Now we're talking. Just over half a second, you can start hitting moving targets at this point. But you could probably see the issue of where this is going. Even at 50%, which is entering the threshold of where it makes sense, where are we generating enough juice to accelerate a projectile to 50% the speed of light? For fun, because no one is accelerating anything to 50% of the speed of light without some MacGuffin. Napkin math means, we'll assume 100% kinetic energy. We're going to ignore gravitational potential energy. K equals mv squared, yada, 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 600-ton projectile. We're getting 600 million gigajoules. Yeah, I'm a pathetic human being. I can't wrap my head around numbers that big. And this is why large percentage of speed of light projectiles don't really work, because even at 1% the speed of light, these projectiles are producing so much instantaneous energy that the discharge of the capacitors would probably just melt your ship and the 5 ships around you. Doing some more lame math, even really heavy spaceships, right, that don't really care about weight nearly as much, are going to have so much recoil that they're just going to turn everyone on the inside into spaghetti as your ship accelerates backwards. At this point, I got more into the math, right? I did a bunch of comparisons, and theory really begins to go to shit because you reverse engineer some of the math in these Halo battles. For specifically, I was looking at Sigma Octavius 4, which is one of the more famous ones in the Fall of Reach novel, and a case where Halo Max actually result in a semi-win in a battle when they use it like a bunch of muskets. And you quickly realize none of this works. Like, you do some reverse math and you figure out the Coveys are shooting torpedoes almost traveling at the speed of light. One of the ships, Captain Key ships, I forgot the name, Iroquois or something, has to go like 20% the speed of light at relative speeds multiple times to make it make sense that it shows up in certain locations. Yeah. So I'm going to stop doing math because it turns out the books don't really behave very well in terms of math. So, yeah, when you look at something which is generally considered reasonable, like the Halo Max, we're noticing they're traveling fractions the speed of light. And even then, when you think about it, they're actually functionally useless, considering you need a formation of something like, I don't know, like, what was it, 100 ships firing at volley style, when the reality is missiles used in proper swarm methodologies would produce far more energy on target than the Max do, right? In the books, they say they don't, but they would. And then we look at something like Stellaris, where you look at the travel distances, right? You're engaging from like halfway across the solar system, and like you don't need a fast ship to dodge something that takes that long to go across the system, or you need to have a projectile that is traveling universally breaking fast. Like even an ocean liner can dodge a Mach projectile fired from across the solar system. Yeah, all you really need to do is have your formation slightly spread out, moving in a semi-erratic pattern under full steam, and you can dodge 100%, functionally speaking, 100% of these projectiles. It doesn't matter how big your volley fire is. When you're shooting with sub 1% hit rates, it just doesn't end up working out, and any other weapon system available to you will be far more effective. All right, this conversation has completely degraded. But let me give one final aspect to it. There's always the assumption that you can't really intercept Mach projectiles or railgun projectiles that are traveling a fraction of the speed of light, which it's questionable if you can get them to this fraction of the speed of light, and then it's questionable if you're ever going to be in a range where a 1%, 2%, 3% fraction of the speed of light weapon like this would even be useful, right? We've discussed it. But even then, these things are actually quite easy to intercept. Like, really. We're going to assume the technology is roughly the same, right? So if you have even a slower Mach in reverse, you could actually just intercept enemy Machs quite easily with a fraction of the power behind yours. Because it turns out this projectile has to travel directly towards you, otherwise it's not going to hit. And relatively speaking, a projectile traveling directly towards you is insanely easy to hit. From your point of view, to your tracking systems, it's this glowing ball of tungsten that is just slightly getting larger over its travel path. And intercepting it means sending something into its travel path. And with travel times being multiple seconds, tens of seconds sometimes, that's easy to intercept with a lot of weapon systems. And you don't need to kill it. You just need to move it off course enough that it won't hit you. The only scenario where I actually see Mach or railgun tech in the fashion described in Halo actually working is with point jumping, where you can jump to within that 100 kilometer engagement range, or where stealth tech is so good everyone can just walk up to each other and get to eyeball range like Star Wars style. And then sure, the Mach system works. But that's never the case in sci-fi. Alright, I'll be real, this kind of degraded pretty hard. I'm way off the reservation in terms of my notes, so I'm going to just leave it here, and yeah, this is going to be a spicy comment section, I feel like. Yeah, okay. We'll see you guys later. For the next video, I'll talk about Space Engineers and its railgun, and how the exact same issues I've mentioned above, speed and reload time, kind of make the Space Engineers Mach, the railgun, kind of crappy. Alright, thanks for watching, I'll see you guys later.